From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief Radio. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch, broadcasting this week from Washington, D.C.
When we actually do things together, it feels really good, and it feels hope. It feels like, you know what? I'm here with other people, my body's in motion, and I feel like we can do something, rather than being at home just feeling like the world is ending.
An outsized influence on our politics and culture continues to come from evangelical Christianity. Often news reports shorthand the agenda of conservative white evangelical Protestants as Christian, or even worse, people of faith. But thanks to a pair of recent books, we've got a chance to look at the historic and current influence of white Christian evangelicals and its connection to Christian nationalism, plus what it means for our nation going forward. I have wanted to have Dr. Bradley Onishi on this show for a long time. His book, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. It was released fittingly on January 6th, and Brad has firsthand experience with this movement, and his book is both a comprehensive history and a call to action.
And when folks ran afoul of the gatekeepers, they got written out of the history books, such that you never hear about this Black evangelical movement or the evangelical feminist movement, or that there were gay evangelicals, because these folks have gotten written out of the story.
Dr. Isaac B. Sharp has just released The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians and the movement that pushed them out. It's a book that explores the history of a movement that has gone through a stunning transformation on its way to consolidating power and influence. Looking at how many have been left behind exposes the essential flaws of today's political Christianity, but it also offers hope for reclaiming an authentic and inclusive form of the faith. You can hear State of Belief on the radio and get the podcast on Apple Podcasts and all the other podcast platforms. Every week, I am in conversation with some of the most fascinating and impactful civic and religious leaders across the nation. Please subscribe to it today. State of Belief Radio is made possible in great part because of the generous support of our listeners. If you have made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my first guest. Brad Onishi is the host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast, the most popular religion and politics podcast on Apple Podcast. His new book is titled Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. And I am glad he is with us today. Brad, welcome to State of Belief Radio.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. It's an honor to be here, and always happy to chat with you. Thank you.
Oh, me too. Now let's first of all, I just want to say, like, you landed on perhaps the best podcast name ever. Like, I mean, how did that happen? Like, it's so funny, and my guess is there's people out there who are like, oh, great, that's the podcast for me. But I think, and then they listen to it and they're like, wait a second. But how did you come up with that? Like, what's the genesis of that name?
You know, it was deep in the Trump years, 2018, and I took a 2-hour drive to see my friend Dan Miller, who's my co-host, and I said, Dan, you know, we're academics, but I think as former evangelicals, we have something to say. And I think a lot of people in this country, their problem comes down to the fact that they think Jesus was a straight white American guy driving a big truck and holding an automatic rifle and voting Republican. And so let's try to figure that out through a podcast. And you're exactly right, Paul. So I just the other day had the Daily Wire reach out to see if they could advertise on the show because I think they just thought, finally, somebody who worships a straight
God,
white American Jesus.
Someone's speaking the truth, right? I mean, someone is brave enough to speak the truth. And that's Brad Onishi, everyone. No, it's so genius. And that is actually a great story. I love that. I mean, it's almost like you prank them. I mean, it's really, really good. But, it also, like, it kind of leads us into your own background. I mean, this is not something that you've observed from afar. You come out of this a very particular experience in American religion. I wonder if you can just take us there as a way of getting into your new book, like where you come from, how you came to be a part of this culture, and how you view it now. But let's start with like where you come from.
Yeah, so I grew up in Orange County, California, made famous by various TV shows and all that stuff. Pretty middle-class family, dad drove a Corolla, that kind of, going to a state park for vacation kind of stuff. He is Japanese American, my mom's white, and pretty non-religious household. But when I was 14, my 14-year-old girlfriend, my 8th grade girlfriend, invited me to a Wednesday night Bible study. By that time, I was a kind of punk who was getting in trouble. And it was a mega church. And I think a lot of people out there don't imagine Southern California as this kind of religious landscape that it is. But, where I grew up was really the Bible Belt of Southern California. And this was just one of many mega churches in the area. And I got hooked. I got hooked on the guitars and the young leaders with tattoos and the fun youth group games. And fast forward, by the time I was 20, I was a full-time minister. I got married to my high school sweetheart. And I started seminary pretty soon thereafter. So my conversion was really extreme. I can tell you stories about me being just a really weird little guy who was a very zealous convert. But I stayed in the religion game after leaving evangelicalism and am now a religion professor and have been studying these things, philosophically and historically for 20 years now. But yeah, it all goes back to just getting invited to a Wednesday night Bible study and my mom saying, sure.
You write, one of your chapters is just so provocative. It said, would I have been there? I might be getting it a little bit wrong, but it's essentially posing this idea. I was close to being in the crowd on January 6th. That would not have been a stretch for me had I continued on the trajectory I was at. So in some ways, you're like being really honest, like this is not foreign. This is not totally other to you. Like talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think these days there's a lot of space to talk about being an ex-evangelical or ex-LDS. There's communities, there's support groups, there's books. It's a lot harder to come out and say, hey, I used to be a Christian nationalist. And yeah, I think I maybe a white Christian nationalist. But when I watched January 6th, that really clicked for me that, yes, I've identified as an ex-evangelical for a long time. But my church was one that had Christian nationalist elements such that there were people who were from my hometown, from the church, who were at January 6th. And what I realized is, all right, if this happens right around my conversion, if January 6th and the Trump years are right around my conversion, those are the years where I am zealous. I mean, where I am willing to go all out. I am preparing for the rapture. I am proselytizing every chance I get. I write in the book that I would go to my the flagpole outside of my high school on every Friday, and I would pray for the nation, and people would be walking by me like, who is this weird kid, like praying to the flagpole? So in those years, I was ready to go. And if there had been a man in my church who was like, hey, Brad, we need to go to DC and fight for the country. I paid for your plane ticket. Let's go. I think I would have said yes. And it really scared me.
I think part of the confluence there is the invitation, like, we need to bring Jesus, because people brought Jesus to January 6th. That was, their understanding of Jesus, the white Christian, the white American straight Jesus to January 6th. So if they had framed this as part of your religious fervor, I think that's the nut of it. This is what it means to be a good Christian today. And I think that's the trap, frankly, of Christian nationalism, where someone goes from a conservative Christian, which is, by the way, anybody's right to be. And if that gives you hope and if that gives you life, great, do it. But it's where the way you act this out is you go to January 6th and you subvert the will of the people. I'm sure you would have gone. If someone had framed it as part of your faith commitment by an authority, you would have gone.
Oh, totally. And this is where, people ask me, well, what's Christian about Christian nationalism? And I say, look, if you approach me in that church and you're like, hey, we got to go defend white people, I would have looked at you like, no, I'm not doing, I'm not into that. Right. But if you said, look, we've got to go pray for the country, we've got to go act and show up for God's will, then you've got my interest as that 19-year-old who's really committed to ministry, or that 21-year-old. If you just show up and talk to me about white nationalism, I'm not going to do it. But if you show up and say, God wants this man to be president and we have to be on the ground, and then I'm like, okay, you know what? I think I'm on board. I'll go and pray. I'll go and support. And then maybe I get caught up in the crowd and here we go. We are off and running, which happened to so many people, including people from my hometown.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's that, how much are you willing to give for God?
Yeah.
That's
right.
like the real, that's presented, I think, to in some faith communities. And then it's like, oh, you give your life because Jesus gave his life. And, anyway, it's just like, it's very disturbing because it's mind control and political power wrapped up in faith, and this is what brings us to Christian nationalism.
And it's like you can never give enough. There's always more to sacrifice.
Right.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is ongoing. I mean, this didn't stop after, as you know. So talk to us a little bit about how you understand the history of Christian nationalism as part of the America that we know. I mean, give us, how far back do you go? It's, the history, we're kind of writing this because we're identifying things and giving it a name now that might be a little new, but it's always, there's been strands of it all the way through. So talk to me about how you understand the history.
You said the America we know. So I start my book and I really focus on the 1960s. When I was an evangelical, when I was part of the church I mentioned, we were always taught that the 1960s is when the country lost its way. The 1960s is when the sexual revolution and nuclear families all dissolved America into this chaotic, corrupt, godless place that it is today. And we weren't the only ones. If you look at recent comments by leaders of Focus on the Family and, prominent megachurch pastors, they will tell you the 60s are when it all went wrong. Well, let's think about that. The 1960s are a time, and I don't probably have to remind most people listening, but, real quick, Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, immigration reform, the Loving Case, 1967, protects interracial marriage, 1963, feminine mystique, the late 60s and mid to late 60s, there's a movement of mainline pastors and queer communities working together in New York City and other places. And then Stonewall happens. All that to say, a time for, I think, many Americans of great progress, if unfinished progress. And yet this is when the white Christian nationalist says, look, it all went wrong then. And I asked myself, all right, so how did they manifest that? And one of the places is in a far right extremist move in the Republican Party that eventually links up with what we know as the religious right. So in the 1960s, for example, Barry Goldwater is the GOP candidate in 1964. And he says when he accepts the nomination, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Extremism is what you need. We don't need dialogue. We don't need respect. We don't need a middle path. We need extremism to take our country back. And throughout the book, I kind of follow that thread and say, this is how political operatives plus the religious right really affected a Christian nationalist kind of takeover of the GOP and led to what we are seeing today.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, that is such an important inflection point. I mean, I just sometimes look, there's ways you could start the story further back, the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
There's other times when it manifested, but I think that's really helpful because for some of us, that's may not be in memory, but it's basically recent history. Yeah. And we're seeing, if you look at what's happening right now, women's rights rolled back, queer rights rolled back, an attempt to erase history with banning books, rolling back race, voting restrictions. All of these things. This is the battle, and it is the '60s battle continuing, and it's absolutely shocking, and I think that's a helpful beginning. So I want to just talk about one chapter that really made me sit up, and that was your chapter on purity, and it was called "Pure American Body." And honestly, I just think this is so interesting, and it's a connection that until you wrote it, I had not made. But talk about this idea that you have that rings totally true to me.
Yeah, so I, like many children of the '90s, I'm a veteran of purity culture, and I know many people out there will know purity culture is that kind of movement that taught young conservative Christian kids in the '80s and '90s and early 2000s that you needed to remain pure for God, which means sexual purity. Okay, so don't have sex before marriage. All right, well, that's easy enough. But if you think about sex at all, that's adultery, so don't do that. And along with this, we're going to have all of these gender roles. We're going to give you the idea that boys and men are naturally leaders, but they're aggressive and they're filled with raging sexual desire, and they really have a hard time controlling it. And nonetheless, they should be in charge at home and in society and, of course, at church. Girls and women are naturally submissive. They're naturally the kind of supportive partner. They, in terms of sex, want sex for intimacy, not for pleasure. So they need to be the gatekeepers of this sexual purity and not let their boyfriends or fiancés sort of cross the line before marriage. And there's this whole culture, and if you're part of this culture, all of the devices and the techniques and the teachings that scare you into trying to remain pure before you get married. And one thing that really dawned on me as I was writing this book is that Christian nationalism is the original purity culture. And if you hang with me here, one thing that my co-host Dan Miller says all the time, and he writes about this in his book, is that there's this metaphor that's been used for millennia of the nation or the country or the state as a body, the national body. If we said, hey, what does the Canadian body look like? What is the Swedish? What is the Chinese? Well, what does the American body look like? And what we talk about all the time is that for the white Christian nationalists, the American body is a straight body. It's a white body. It's a body that is native born. It's a body that is able-bodied, probably. It speaks English as a first language, and it is patriarchal and Christian, right? I mean, you can imagine the kind of national body that the Christian nationalist imagines, and it kind of looks like, I don't know, a straight white American Jesus or a Donald Trump or any other sort of patriarchal conservative leader you might think of. Unfortunately, a lot of Christian nationalists, Vladimir Putin, okay? And what I realized is that purity culture in the 90s was an attempt to regulate teenage bodies in order to create a national body that looks like the ones Christian nationalists want. The idea here is if you regulate young teenage flesh and make it quote unquote pure of anything that involves a queer relationship, a non-heteronormative heteronormative relationship, a mixed family, a complex family, marrying those outside from immigrants or those from outside of the country, from another place.
Or
in some cases,
religion, religion.
Interfaith marriage.
It's all defilement.
It's impure, right? I mean,
Impure.
even interracial marriage for a lot of people,
Right.
even interracial marriage, impure. So there's all these impurities that we want to keep out of our families. And if we can keep them out of our families, we can keep them out of our churches. If we can keep out of our churches, we can keep it out of our nation. So purify the teenage flesh, get a pure American body. That's the wager. And so that's what dawned on me in that chapter. And that's why I think Christian nationalism is the original purity culture.
Right. I mean, and the idea that there is purity, and that and then also that like purity must be protected at all costs. Like it's a highest virtue, and then anything foreign or is a threat to purity and must be eliminated. And anybody who's been in that culture, I mean, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at John Ward's new book, Testimony, but he talks about how terrible that was for him. and like how all of it was so terrible, and and it just diminished him in a terrible way, and he was racked with guilt, and there was no way, it was just I just think this is a really interesting analogy, and it's another way to begin to understand in some ways what we're up against, which is like a very kind of just a do or die mentality among Christian nationalists about what they're fighting to preserve, this mythic thing they're trying to preserve. And I think Jeff Charlotte gets at it with his great book The Undertow. Your book. What I like about your book is that, among many things, it's a national story told through a personal lens. So it has the benefit of not like talking about them, but talking about something that you feel very akin to. Talk to me a little bit about how you see Christian nationalism factoring right into our politics right now.
Yeah, I think one thing that is really important for me to emphasize is that Christian nationalism is more than anything, it's a cultural identity. And the way I explain that to folks is it's a story that you tell about yourself. Oh, I'm a Christian man. I'm a Christian husband and a Christian dad, and I'm a Christian American. So for me, it's about family, country, God. All right, that's who I am. That's the story I'm telling about how I conduct myself and how I'm raising my kids and how I spend my free time and who I support politically, whatever it may be. Okay, so I'm telling a story about me, and I'm telling a story about my country. And that's Christian nationalism. And I can tell that story even if I'm not somebody who goes to church twice a week or reads the Bible every morning. So Christian nationalism is really quite nimble and quite agile, because if you tell the story, you don't have to be somebody who's tithing 10% to a mega church on Sundays or volunteering to teach Sunday school. You can take on that cultural identity. And when you do that, you can start to see your identity as part of a movement that says, yeah, I'm scared my kids are learning woke stuff at school. So yeah, I'm going to show up at the school board meeting and I'm going to yell about all these woke books by Toni Morrison and talking about Japanese incarceration. And I want those out of here. And I'll support this movement. And yeah, I'm going to go and protest drag queen story hour because kids, and I'm worried about that. So we see the ways that Christian nationalism as a narrative can fuel political support and movements, even if you don't have people who are fully committed about getting to church every Sunday or reading the Bible every day. Now, in terms of actual just on the ground policies, I think there are so many ways that we are seeing this. So let's start in Texas. In Texas, there were numerous tragedies this past weekend here in the middle of May, and yet no calls for sweeping gun reform or legislation. And yet there is a bill that is being put through, and it may be put through already, which would list the 10 commandments on every public school classroom in Texas. Okay. And there's been some coverage of this, but not enough. So let's post the 10 commandments in every classroom. If you're a Hindu kid, if you're a secular kid, if you're a Muslim kid, tough luck. Does not matter. Just yesterday, Ron DeSantis in Florida signed a bill that says if you're a Chinese person, you cannot buy property, and especially you cannot buy property in Florida near military bases or government buildings. Now, there's a lot to debate there. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of real estate in this country and income inequality. But here's the thing. That is on the backs of policies in Florida, where he is flying migrants to Martha's Vineyard, where he is gutting tenure, where he is banning books. When I think of those things, I come back to what we just talked about, Paul. I want a pure America. Right. I want to purify this nation from all the invaders and the infections and the diseases. And that's how I think of immigrants. That's how I think of ideas I don't like. That's how I think of people from China or from Mexico. That's how I think of gay people, because I'm going to pass a law. Don't say gay.
Just to do with DeSantis, he, with this anti-DEI thing that he's put across the country for all higher education. We had on Matt Hartley, he's in Northeast Florida at a university there. Interfaith work is all under DEI. And so he has actually seen like his work being attacked So you're not supposed to actually have conversations between evangelical kids and Muslim kids and Hindu kids and secular kids, because that's DEI. And so it's like it's just a frontal attack on religious diversity, religious freedom. In the name, again, I think it is of like, we got to protect the kids. I mean, protect which kids? From what? From what? So I just really, I think the one of the things that I feel we as those of us who are trying to mobilize against Christian nationalism need to be really clear to that guy who you described and say, you should be a Christian if you want to be a Christian, and be a man and protect your family. Patriotism is not synonymous with nationalism.
Yeah.
Christianity is not synonymous with Christian nationalism. We have to allow people another avenue and say you can be all of these things and love your family and love your faith and love your country. And actually, that should turn you away from Christian nationalism. I think the invitation has to be stronger. So I'm just wondering, if you could wave a magic wand for all of us to do exactly what Bradley Onishi says, which I know you pine for this, what would we all be doing in order to offset what feels like I feel like we're in an existential moment for the country? What should we do? What should we focus on?
What I always tell folks is, look, if you're like me, it's easy to consume a lot of news, a lot of tweets, a lot of scrolling, especially late at night, and you can get overwhelmed. You can think about everything from what's happening at the border, what's happening with DEI, what's happening with trans kids and gender affirming care, what's happening with reproductive rights, what's happening with voting rights. I mean, we can go down the list. I wish that everyone listening would sit down for a minute, take some notes, and say, what is the one thing that I think that I care about, that I'm impassioned about, and I can get involved in? What is the thing that I can give time and effort and energy to starting now? And that could be any number of things. That could be supporting somebody who's going to run for a school board seat because your school board is under threat of being taken over by Moms for Liberty and the anti-CRT MAGA crowd. That could be supporting a county supervisor candidate. Okay, great. That could be getting involved in the fight for reproductive rights in your community. That could be running yourself for mayor. That could be figuring out how to protect trans kids in your community. Are there networks? Are there pipelines of safety? Are there people helping others make sure that kids are not in danger in various ways? Are there queer family networks that you might plug into and support and be part of? I could go on and on and on. Yeah. I think what's easy, though, especially after COVID, is to scroll, is to feel despair, but to not jump in somewhere. And Paul, I saw you recently at a conference and a summit, and one of the things that is so clear to me, and there's nothing profound about this, there's nothing like genius, but when we actually do things together, it feels really good, and it feels hope. It feels like, you know what? I'm here with other people. My body's in motion, and I feel like we can do something rather than being at home just feeling like the world is ending.
So here's my question for you. What worries you the most right now?
Sorry, there's a lot. So I think what worries me the most right now is that we think what I get asked all the time. I speak all over the country and people say, are we going to have another civil war? And I think that my answer is always, we have small fires everywhere right now. This past week, you had a mass shooting in Texas. And one, prominent right-wing figure, Megyn Kelly, said, look, stop with the debates. You're not going to win, liberals. There's not going to be gun reform because we have the Second Amendment. So let's just look for other options. And in my mind, that was such a nihilistic take. And it was such a take of defeatism that says, look, you're not going to win. That call to me was one that says, it's over. Kids will continue to die. If you go to a mall, if you go to a parade, if you go to Walmart, if you go to church, you might be in gun danger. So what? We're not going to do anything. So let's figure something else out. My worry is that we think this is the future, that it's coming in a year or 2 or 3 or 5. There was another incident in Texas where migrants outside of a migrant center were intentionally run over. And I believe, and I have to check this for sure, I believe it was 6 or 7 people who died. that is somebody who is intentionally ending the lives of people from other countries who are here in this country for various reasons.
Outside of a church, outside of a Catholic church that housed them. I mean, it was really an attack on religion, a real one.
Right. And it's never framed that way. It's never framed as you attacked a Catholic church that has the values of welcoming others, welcoming your neighbor, welcoming the stranger, welcoming whoever. But that is an attack on religion, 100%. And so we have a country where, I talked to somebody at a conference recently who said, I live in South Carolina. I have a trans kid and we have a bag packed because we know that we may need to leave in the middle of the night, at any night. That's the world we live in now. We live in a world where you might get sued if you text with your friend about, ending an unwanted pregnancy by way of abortion and so on. We live in a world where you have anti-trafficking laws in certain states related to reproductive rights. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Our public square at the moment is one where there are battles everywhere. And because it's not North versus South, it's easy to be like, no Civil War. We had January 6th and that happened. We haven't seen anything like that yet. So I don't know. Let's just see what happens. I'm tired. It's been a long couple of years. That's all in the future. And that worries me a lot because I think that we're not ready to confront it's not a one battle line, North versus South. It is hundreds of small fires everywhere raging from Georgia to California to Idaho I just got emails from a friend in Amherst, Mass, who's like, here is an attack on trans kids and people getting dead naming. And if anybody knows Amherst, Mass, it's like one of the most liberal, lefty parts of the country. And I'm getting those emails from there. So,
yeah. No, I mean, I live in Chelsea, New York, and we have protests against drag queens in Chelsea. And so, anyway, okay, so this is the nadir. We're going to go to the zenith. What gives you hope? Like, what are you hopeful for? What's the source of that hope, and how can we fuel that hope?
What gives me hope is that if you visit places that seem like they are the places that are most in dire need of some kind of glimmer of light, that is where people are organizing. That is people are working together. You talked about Fresno and these coalitions of interfaith leaders. I talked to one student leader who's of Indian descent and yet is working with Black clergy in Nashville to form coalitions around gun violence and all stemming from the expulsion of the Tennessee Two. And so when you go across the country, there are people who realize that this is an existential fight for what we call American democracy. And that gives me hope. And I think that it's, once again, if you're sitting home at Twitter and just scrolling, you're probably very unlikely to see that. But if you actually get involved anywhere, whether it's Chelsea, New York, Washington, D.C., whether it's, Baton Rouge or Albuquerque or Fresno or Portland, you're going to see that there are people who care so much about a world that is inclusive, that is full of equality and liberty for everyone, and who want to create a future that's based on this American experiment. So that is happening. And if you're not seeing it, I would say get out to a place where you can and where you can be involved, because it will give you hope too, even as we face a future that is uncertain.
Dr. Bradley Onishi teaches and researches Christian nationalism, the history of evangelicalism, race and racism in American religion, gender, sex, masculinity, and secularism and secularity. He's the host of the very popular Straight White American Jesus podcast, now in its 5th year. His books include The Sacrality of the Secular, Postmodern Philosophy of Religion, and most recently, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. Brad, thank you so much for joining me on State of Belief Radio. I really like talking to you, and I'm looking forward to all the work we can do together.
I'm so thankful to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me, and really appreciate you.
Coming up next, Isaac Sharp, the author of a new book, The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians and the movement that pushed them out. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of State of Belief anytime on our website. You'll also find links to the topics we discussed this week, extended interviews and transcripts, and an archive of past shows, all at stateofbelief.com. You're listening to State of Belief Radio, where religion and democracy meet. Dr. Isaac P. Sharp is Director of Online and Part-Time Programs and Visiting Assistant Professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, my alma mater. Last month, Isaac published his new book, The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians and the movement that pushed them out. Isaac, it is great to have you with us on State of Belief Radio.
It's great to be here. I'm excited for the opportunity to chat about the book and to chat again with Paul after having worked together on various projects over the years.
And The Other Evangelicals debuts at #1 on Amazon for books on sociology and religion. You are a star. Let's start with this title, which is not known for its brevity, but its inclusiveness. Introduce, first of all, yourself and why this book.
The most direct answer is it came out of my dissertation. A bit of a longer backdrop is that it grew out of exploration that I had done over the years during my own MDiv. I have an MDiv from Mercer University where I worked with David Gushee, who was my advisor at Mercer in the MDiv program. And then I worked for him for the Center for Theology and Public Life for a year before I started my PhD. During that time period, he and I worked together on a book called Evangelical Ethics, a reader in Evangelical Ethics, and it's a selection of various kinds of influential thinkers across the 20th century in American evangelical space, and those specifically who focused on, social, ethical, personal, moral issues. And in the beginnings of working on that book and in working closely with my friend and mentor, David Gushee, I began thinking through these questions of what it means in contemporary context to say, yes, I am an evangelical, or who is an evangelical, or who's not an evangelical. And one of the interesting places that it most directly became a question was as David Gushee and I were working on that book, making decisions about who goes in a book like that and who doesn't go in a book like that. And some of that research for me began the process of asking this question of who gets counted as evangelical and not, and the kind of discovery that I think that there's a story there that generally isn't told in the popular and scholarly sources about evangelicalism.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I read that title, I was like, and I was curious, would Walter Rauschenbusch be included as an evangelical? Because certainly in his mind he was, but then almost he became the kind of flashpoint for deciding what isn't an evangelical. Although he wrote a book called Christianizing the Social Order, something that you wouldn't want to get away with today. I mean, it is, and he worked with Moody, and he was very interested in the prayers and the hymnody and all of that. And yet, no, he's like the opposite of an evangelical today. He's like, we're not evangelical. So it is interesting, who doesn't qualify. I often say today, the only way anyone can claim being an evangelical today is if they say they're anti-gay or they're anti-abortion. That's the thing that allows you to continue to be in the club. The moment you step over the line, you're not part of the club. You can prove me wrong, but all I'm saying, I'm entering into the conversation that you entered into more fulsomely with this book.
Yes, and Walter Rauschenbusch is a prime example of something that I argue happened historically. And what happened historically, I argue, is that the evangelical label was more in flux for a longer period of time than folks realize. So into the 20th century, with the fundamentalist modernist controversies and these fights over who is in and out of various American denominations, and this you retroactively get this split between the liberal mainline and the conservative evangelical. This is the so-called two-party thesis in American Protestantism. And historically, then the idea is that never the twain then meet. They go their separate directions. And it's really interesting that it's more complicated than that. There are these figures back there in the story who considered themselves evangelical. And what they would have meant by that would be various things. But in some cases, at least, it's faithfulness to the gospel, right? They would say, I may be a progressive on economic issues, or I may be a theological liberal, meaning that I accept Darwinian evolution or higher critical methodologies. But that doesn't, in their telling, these liberal evangelicals, but that doesn't make me any less faithful to the gospel. And part of what I was doing in the dissertation in the book with that chapter in particular is saying that story of these folks who are these early progenitors of what becomes, kind of the other direction in American Protestantism, are lost from the stories specifically around evangelical identity when they considered themselves evangelicals and faithful to the gospel. And it's just this like fascinating piece of the story that really gets left out. On the other end, the anti-gay piece, any number of these chapters could be the most controversial. But number one on the liberal evangelicals and the last chapter on gay evangelicals are definitely in the running for the most controversial.
I do think that it's a really interesting and important book for right now, because almost evangelical has lost its meaning. I don't even know what we mean anymore by evangelical. And it's become a political category more than it is a descriptive of a certain stance towards religion. All these different categories of people who have been pushed out of being able to claim that label, it's all about politics, and it's about other things perhaps outside of the gospel. So I'm just curious how you feel about that.
Yes. So part of the argument that I am setting out in the book is that evangelical identity over the course of the 20th century and into the dawn of the 21st century took on these certain connotations, and that part of how it took on these connotations is by gatekeeping, because evangelicalism is this kind of nebulous thing that doesn't have an official roster of members like a denomination does, or an officially recognized singular leader who everyone can point to as like that person is the head of evangelicalism. Although Billy Graham could vie for that category, could vie for that unofficial title in the 20th century context. But part of what I'm arguing is that because of that kind of nebulous movement that changes and shifts over time, that across the 20th century, you get this periodic thing that happens where these folks who built this movement of generally theologically conservative Protestants have to deal with the fact that there is internal pluralism in building a coalition of generally conservative Protestants. There's an internal pluralism that's going on. And what regularly happens that I end up arguing in the book is there are folks who say, yes, I believe XYZ theological tenet that you say is the requirement to be called evangelical. A focus on the Bible, belief in the authority of Scripture, whatever the changing qualifications are. You get these folks who say, yes, I agree with that, but I vote Democrat, or I am a feminist, or I interpret the quote unquote clobber passages in the Christian scriptures that folks usually interpret as referring to homosexuality, or I interpret those passages differently, but I still hold to the authority of Scripture. And so these folks that I end up talking about in the book, many of them said and grew up and spent their lives or chose later at some point to move among the religious community called evangelical, because it's it's where they believed they belonged in line with the theology. And then there would be one thing, there would be some extra little qualification that would get paraded out by gatekeepers, and they would say, but that's you agree to all these points, but if you vote this way, or you think that about feminism, or you're gay, or you're black, there's something else all of a sudden that becomes an extra requirement. And when folks ran afoul of those of the gatekeepers, they got written out of the history books, such that you never hear about this black evangelical movement or the evangelical feminist movement, or that there were gay evangelicals, because these folks have gotten written out of the story.
Right. Well, and you kind of you think of movements like the Southern Baptist takeover in the late 70s, which was like it was a big power play. I mean, it was like women preaching, women teaching, and that was like an accepted part of what like it was to be a Southern Baptist, was that, and then all of a sudden it was like, nope. And then they got kicked out. And so it is like, when you say gatekeepers, that's what it also is like evictors. I mean, like people who literally will say, you no longer are welcome here. And you think about the damage that does to the people who are evicted, and then how the paucity of who remains. I mean, like, that's like the other part of this story. It's like it's terrible for people to get kicked out of church. It's a damaging, traumatic. But then you think about, oh, well, what are you left with? And, this idea of like this purity, or this like, and then you're always fearful. Are you going to be the next? Yeah, I just think it sounds like a horror show.
It is definitely the case. The part of the argument that I end up making is that you get these power brokers, gatekeepers, often self-appointed in evangelical spaces across the 20th century and into the 21st century, who end up drawing a tighter and tighter circle around who is in and who's out. And part of the argument I end up making is that these folks end up remaking evangelical identity in their own image, such that the only people who are left, who are the official, safe, recognized evangelicals whose credentials aren't challenged, are those who look, think, act, vote, literally look like white, straight, Calvinist Republicans. And that they're
well, we just talked to Brad Onishi, who has this great podcast, Straight White American Jesus. It is. I mean, that's what it is, honestly. And everybody else is there if you can adopt that identity. I mean, right. Like, this is like, it is, it is interesting. And it just seems like, you're putting a lot of people in like this no man's land of like, I know a lot. I mean, you think about the movement, like, the gay church, like the Metropolitan Gay Church, that if you've ever been to one of them, like for me, as I grew up kind of liberal Protestant, and I go in there, I'm like, what evangelical, like, it just happens to all be gay guys and gay women and bisexual and transgender. But the fervor is very evangelical. It just so happens that they were all evicted. And so, so it's interesting. You could, like, this is something that is in people's blood, and yet they can't, they're not able to stay in their broader community. And so they have to leave and they find other community. And again, what's left loses out, because there's like deep spirituality and power in these various communities that have been kicked out. And I think it's sad.
And the MCC, the Metropolitan Community Churches, are a piece of this story in a very concrete way, because of the very reason that you're talking about. The emergence of the MCC is this in certain iterations of it. I didn't get to talk too much about this in the book, but I do mention a little bit, I think, where the certain congregations of Metropolitan Community Church, just right, it is like a very evangelical and or sometimes Pentecostal flavor to some of them, that that it is the case that you have these folks who say, this is how we want to be in religious community and worship. We don't necessarily want to go down the street to the liberal mainline church that would, fly the gay flag. And that's a piece of this story. That's a piece of the 20th century American Christian story that is really not told enough, I think. Somebody like Troy Perry is a fascinating example of this. I could have included I think I included some mention of Troy Perry in the book, but not a profile. There needs to be more historical work on Troy Perry as somebody who was like, yeah, I'm evangelical
Oh,
and
hardcore.
I'm gay. And
And if
there's,
you've
and
ever heard
that
him
just is
preach,
what
you're
it
like,
is.
okay, here comes the Spirit. You know, one thing that is a part of this story, and is how you view the salvific power of other traditions. Like one of the things that I've written about, because I have Jewish cousins, and I've written publicly, like, if heaven doesn't include my Jewish cousins, I don't want to go there. I think that's another element of, like, the evangelical, like, you can't allow for the fact that people might get redemption or enlightenment or fulfillment, true fulfillment, honest fulfillment, and respect that fulfillment, and remain an evangelical that thinks everyone who isn't saved exactly in the way you're saved is going to hell.
This thing around interfaith work also, though, is a piece of the story where there is something going on in evangelical circles, specifically, explicitly in the 20th century, that is a rejection of a certain kind of interfaith engagement. The interesting thing that happens with the emergence of the official evangelical organizations like the National Association of Evangelicals and Christianity Today is, in fact, that those organizations were explicitly predicated on the idea that the ecumenical movement is a liberal, backsliding, dangerous thing that is watering down true doctrine for the sake of ecumenical cooperation. And you get this rejection of that as very foundational to 20th century evangelical identity, where you have these organizations that say all those liberals that are in charge of all the main denominations are joining in even cross-denominational work, and they're watering down the gospel. And that is it's a strong preventative to certain kinds of interfaith conversations.
For sure. I mean, it's interesting. Like, when I was at Princeton running interfaith work at Princeton, often the evangelicals wanted to be there because they actually really liked talking to people who took religion seriously. So I think that there's, manifestations of that in different ways. My guest is Isaac Sharp, author of The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians, and the movement that pushed them out. I just think the political aspect of evangelicalism is really fascinating. And here you have, like, the figure of Jimmy Carter, who is probably the most serious evangelical we've had. Like, I mean, but this gets to your point. If you talk to him, he will talk about Jesus. I mean, he's like a serious dude as far as evangelical. And I think maybe the first time he ran, people were like thinking they should support him, and then they flip and they go to Reagan. And then since that time, it's been anathema. I mean, Barack Obama had a little moment, but not really. And so then you find this. I just find it so strange. I mean, we just, Donald Trump just was convicted of sexual assault. And yet the only response is like, oh, this is terrible that woman would do this to him. And then you're thinking, well, what kind of morality are you actually working with here? I find this like one of the most mystifying things about the modern evangelical reality. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what that like involves and why that has become so hardened in our current moment.
Yes. So that's a big piece of the puzzle. And the chapter that I have specifically on the evangelical left it retraces some of this, right? And how this happens. You get Jimmy Carter come on the scene, and all of a sudden he's talking about having been born again. And And then all of a sudden there are journalists everywhere trying to figure out what that means and who are all these born again folks. And then shortly after Carter's election, this is the 76, and you have the pollsters start saying things like, this is the year of the evangelical. You very quickly on the heels of that get the rise of the religious right. And by the time the 80s are in full swing, it is becoming evangelical identity is becoming closer and closer linked to specifically partisan politics. Over time, I would argue that one of the most determinative aspects of contemporary evangelical identity by this point, let's say by now in the contemporary 21st century context, is that partisan alignment, such that I argue, and I think I even say explicitly in the book, that you can make a strong argument that evangelical is a kind of identity politics. It's a white identity. It's an identity politics for white conservative religious folks. And how that happened is specifically, I argue in the book, one of the ways that you can see how that happens is by tracing the emergence, which actually predated the religious right, of this robust, politically progressive evangelical movement that also historically gets forgotten a lot in the history books. And part of what I argue is that what happened in part with the rise of the religious right is you get folks like Jerry Falwell who define evangelical identity in a certain kind of way, and they consistently undermined and denigrated and challenged the religious credentials of progressive evangelical figures. Within evangelicalism, they had this uphill battle where every time they would say, we believe in Jesus, we affirm the authority of the Bible, and when we read the Bible, we see that you are supposed to care about the poor, right, and that translates for us into progressive politics, such that to be evangelical, to be faithfully evangelical in some of the minds of these evangelical left figures, sometimes would require voting against the Republican Party, and they had their work cut out for them because the religious right was such a formidable force and was so well funded and so well organized that it steamrolled them. Part of what I end up arguing, though, is that one of the really effective rhetorical tactics that folks like Jerry Falwell used was casting aspersions on folks like Jim Wallis and their religious identity. You get these interviews, over a couple of them with Jerry Falwell, where he says things about Jim Wallis like, quote, Jim Wallis is about as evangelical as an oak tree, which is this like weird, right. I don't even know exactly what that means, but the rhetorical move is to say, because his politics is progressive, he obviously can't be an evangelical. And that was a powerful rhetorical move in the kind of public.
Well, I mean, but that's exactly what you're saying. It's excluding him. I remember the way I met Brian McLaren was that some kind of right-wing evangelicals called him warmed over Rauschenbusch, which was the worst insult you could possibly imagine. And then we kind of like, oh, well, as long as you're warmed over Rauschenbusch and I'm left over Rauschenbusch, we might as well have a conversation. And I actually I remember a fellow, I think his name is Tim Tuttle or something like that. He wrote a book called, he discovered Walter Rauschenbusch. He was an hardcore evangelical and actually an evangelical kind of rock star. I mean, he had like a Christian rock band. And then he read Rauschenbusch. He was like, wait, this is like exactly how I feel. Because he has very religious language, and then he was like, okay, where do I go with this? And I think it was very interesting for me to see young evangelicals, people who, this kind of emergent church movement for a while and things like that, the Shane Claibornes of the world who was on this show recently, who are amazing. And I would call them evangelical in part just because they worship slightly in a different way and they kind of preach the gospel in a way that I wasn't really raised to do in the same tenor. I still consider like Shane one of the major evangelicals of American Christianity right now. William Barber as well. I mean, these are people who have deep, deep roots, and they can talk about Jesus, and you're like, well, sign me up. But they're also doing it in a context of respect, for other religious traditions, respect for people who are different from themselves, and in a posture of learning and welcoming and building community. So for you, looking at that story, looking at where evangelicals are in the political cosmology that is so crazy right now, what gives you hope about the movements that you see right now?
In the conclusion, I don't do too much prognosticating except to suggest that that this story that I'm telling, it's my read of what it means for contemporary folks who are interested in challenging what it means to be evangelical is that they have their work cut out for them, because the powers that be are doubling down on defining this narrowly. So, for instance, though, it does seem like we are in an inflection point post 2016 where a lot of folks in evangelical spaces or in Christianity more broadly have looked and said something is off with this whole thing, and they are questioning the religious community that they were brought up in. And a lot of it's generational, although not purely, where you get a group of younger evangelicals or now post-evangelical, whatever the labels that folks want to use for that, who are saying things like, you taught me XYZ about Jesus, the Bible, faith, ethics, personal morality that matters. And now it seems like that rings hollow in light of these political commitments and this falling in line behind Donald Trump. And so it feels to me we are at an inflection point where people who otherwise might not have are asking hard questions about their faith communities and what it means. And there are several folks who are doing this kind of work around offering space for those people who maybe are questioning the political aspects of their faith community, but they're not sure they're not sure what's next or where to go next, or what it means to be a person who, some folks end up, going from that period of questioning and saying, well, maybe I'm an atheist, or maybe I'm agnostic, or maybe I'm not really a Christian at all. But to your point around the earlier point you made about one thing that has happened with evangelicalism, I think that it was an effective kind of PR campaign in some ways, is evangelical leaders and the evangelical movement were really successful at making it seem like they're the only Christian game in town, that they just are the true Christians.
Yeah.
And there are, that's a flattening of the rich diversity of the Christian tradition is complex, and even the evangelical tradition is complex.
What's the connection between what we're calling white Christian nationalism and this remnant that is the core of what people call evangelical today? Are those synonymous?
So that is an interesting question, because it's the white Christian nationalism thing is such a fascinating piece of this puzzle, in that it is a new language in some ways to name an old thing, right? There is, because some of the stuff and that's not to cast any aspersions on the folks who are doing the work, the sociologists or authors who are writing on this stuff. I think they're doing really important work. But it is interesting, the evolution of the terminology, because stuff around white Christian nationalism definitely would have been there in the ether decades ago, right? This is the stuff that is the God and country alignment with Christianity, meaning, Christianize this nation and make the nation Christian again, turn back to God. That stuff goes all the way back to the religious right, and that stuff has been there for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue that it's, goes back to Ku Klux Klan in 1920s, and you can take it way back. It is interesting that it's like we're naming something, and I guess it's a Venn diagram, but it seems like almost at this point the kind of remnant of evangelicalism that you describe after pushing everyone else out, and what we would call Christian nationalism, are almost one-to-one.
in some ways, what I am trying to do with the book is say this story about how evangelicalism became what it is more complicated. So we think we know who the evangelicals are. And in some ways, we do. We know who the capital E official evangelicals are. They are those who look, think, believe, vote like these gatekeepers. And yet it still is in some ways is more complicated than that, where there are folks out there, I think, who would end up checking a lot of the evangelical boxes, who are trying to push back on this stuff, right? I also think of somebody like Beth Moore, who would check all of the boxes and yet has effectively been pushed out of official evangelical rosters because of her willingness to challenge the alignment with Donald Trump. That is a really interesting thing to me, right? Like that, it is an interesting thing where those who would be able to check every box that anybody could throw at them to say, are you an evangelical or not? Even some of them are getting pushed to the margins of this thing.
Well, yeah. And it's interesting. I think it's almost now like, do you support Donald Trump? And
it's
like
wild.
People who said, I won't support Donald Trump before and who have flipped, I think Albert Mohler, from the Southern Baptist, these are people who said never, never, never. And now they're like, yeah, actually, I changed my mind. I'm, definitely behind Donald Trump. And now they're welcome back in. Talk about the courage of your convictions. Anyway,
right. You're watching it happen in some ways, it's the story I'm telling. You can watch it happen in real time, where somebody goes out on a limb on a certain position. Usually it's a political or social issue, gay marriage or a presidential election. And then all of a sudden the gatekeepers come storming the gates.
This is, what you've offered is really focusing on evangelicalism and how we imagine what this term that gets thrown around a lot, what it means today, what it can mean, and also the broad history of what it was, and who gets to decide who gets to call themselves that. Going forward, if journalists are listening to this or people who tell stories or preach, when we use that term, maybe add a few more words to describe what you actually mean by that. Don't default and I'm guilty of this too. Evangelical means white, male, Protestant, straight, all of those things. There's lots of people out there who do not identify that way and who understand themselves to be evangelical maybe it's the small e rather than the big E at this point, Dr. Isaac Sharp is Director of Online and Part-Time Programs and Visiting Assistant Professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He is co-editor of Evangelical Ethics, a Reader, as well as Christian Ethics in Conversation. His important new book is The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians and the movement that pushed them out. Isaac, thank you so much for being with us today on State of Belief Radio. It's really fun to talk to you, and congratulations on your book.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was good, and maybe we will have to have another follow-up conversation one of these days about where Rauschenbusch and the social gospel fits in all this. We touched on it, but there's a lot to discuss there too. So yeah, thanks for having me, Paul.
And with that, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week's show. We need your help keeping State of Belief on the air. I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And you can also be part of making sure informative and encouraging voices like these are heard by sharing this program with family and friends. Let's get more people listening and more people taking part in these conversations both on and off the air. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the weekly State of Belief podcast on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platforms. And join the conversation. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at State of Belief, and share State of Belief with the people in your life. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.